The ring hit the floorboards of Rosa Wells's kitchen with a sound like a gunshot. It was a small thing, that ring, a modest silver band with a turquoise stone that Harlan Reed had carried in his breast pocket for 3 weeks, right over his heart, until the metal had grown warm from his body heat. He had been so certain. He had rehearsed the words 40 times in the mirror above his wash basin, had pressed his good shirt with a flat iron borrowed from the Widow Carmichael down the road, had even trimmed the ragged ends of his dark hair. He had walked the 2 miles from his ranch to the Wells homestead with the June sun blazing down on Cimarron County, New Mexico Territory in the year 1884, and he had believed, truly, deeply believed, that Rosa Wells would say yes. She had not said yes. She had said, with her dark eyes blazing and her chin lifted and her voice steady as the red mesa wall behind her property, "No, Harlan Reed, I will not." And then she had turned her back on him, and the ring had slipped from his stunned fingers, and it had clattered to the floor between them like an accusation. "Rosa!" His voice cracked on her name, one syllable, the most important syllable he had ever spoken. She did not turn around. Her hands gripped the edge of the dry sink. Her knuckles were pale against the worn wood. "You don't even know me," she said. "Not really." The words landed like a blade between his ribs. He had known Rosa Wells for 4 years. He had watched her defend her water rights before the county commissioner when every man in the room assumed she would fold. He had watched her nurse a horse with a broken leg back to usefulness when every sensible rancher would have ended the animal's suffering. He had watched her bury her father alone last winter, standing at the frozen grave with her spine perfectly straight and her face perfectly controlled, and he had stood 20 feet back because he hadn't known how to bridge the distance between them, and he had hated himself for that cowardice ever since. He thought he knew her. He apparently did not. "Pick up the ring, Harlan," she said quietly. "Take it home. Don't come back here with it." He bent down. He picked up the ring. The turquoise stone caught the afternoon light coming through the window, that particular fierce New Mexico light that made everything look both beautiful and merciless. He held the ring for a moment, then closed his fist around it. "Can you at least tell me why?" he asked. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she said, "Because you're asking the wrong question." He walked out of her kitchen, down her porch steps, and back down the red dirt road toward his ranch. The sun was lower now, painting the mesa in shades of amber and rust. His good shirt felt ridiculous. His trimmed hair felt like a lie. And somewhere in the hollow space opening up behind his breastbone, he turned her words over and over like a stone in a riverbed. The wrong question. He had asked, "Will you marry me?" What was the right question? He had not grown up in New Mexico Territory. He had come west from Tennessee in 1878 when he was 22 years old, carrying a carpet bag and a broken understanding of what his future was supposed to look like. His father had been a hard man with a harder hand, and his mother had been a woman who endured that hardness the way mountains endure weather, not by resisting it, but by simply outlasting it. Harlan had always sworn he would be different. He had come west because the West, in those years, had a reputation for letting a man become something new. He had filed a homestead claim on 160 acres east of Cimarron in the summer of 1878, and for 6 years he had worked that land with the kind of focused, grinding determination that a man develops when he is trying to outrun the person he used to be. He had built a house with his own hands. He had run cattle, lost cattle to drought and disease, rebuilt his herd, lost half of it again to a brutal winter, and rebuilt it once more. He was not rich. He was not entirely poor. He was a man in the middle of a territory that rewarded stubbornness, and stubborn was the one thing he had never had trouble being. He had met Rosa Wells at a community meeting about water rights in the summer of 1880. She had been 24 years old and absolutely incandescent with fury, standing before a table of county commissioners who kept addressing their responses to her father instead of to her, even though she was the one speaking. Her father, Miguel Wells, born Miguel Vargas, who had married a woman named Eleanor Wells and taken her name in an act that Cimarron County had never entirely forgiven him for, sat beside her in declining health. And it was Rosa who had mastered the water law, Rosa who had read the federal statutes, Rosa who had built the argument that ultimately won them the upstream access their ranch needed to survive. Harlan had watched from the back of the room and felt something shift inside him that he had no words for at the time. He had subsequent words for it now. He had words like longing, like recognition, like the terrifying sense that he was looking at someone who was going to matter to him in ways he couldn't yet map. But knowing someone mattered to you was not the same as knowing them. He understood that now, walking home with a ring in his fist and the echo of her refusal in his ears. He had watched her from a careful, respectful distance for 4 years. He had helped her mend fences twice, and she had fed him lunch, and they had talked about cattle prices and territorial politics and the reliability of the spring rains. He had attended her father's funeral and stood 20 feet back. He had tipped his hat when he saw her in town and always asked after the ranch and always listened carefully to her answers. But he had never, he saw this now with a clarity that was almost painful, he had never once asked her anything real. He had never asked her what she was afraid of. He had never asked her what she wanted for her life beyond survival. He had never asked what she thought about at night when the ranch was quiet, and the coyotes sang in the distance, and the stars burned cold and enormous overhead. He had watched her and admired her and built an entire idea of her in his mind, and then he had walked into her kitchen and offered her the idea he'd built as though it were a fact. No wonder she had said no. The wrong question. He reached his ranch as the last light faded. He sat on his porch steps in the dark for a long time, turning the ring over in his fingers. Then he went inside, set it on the shelf above his fireplace, and lay down on his bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling until morning came. The next day he went back, not with the ring, not with anything except himself and a question he had spent all night carefully choosing. Rosa was in her south pasture, mending a section of fence that a steer had pushed through. She wore her working clothes, heavy canvas trousers, a faded blue shirt, leather gloves, and her long dark hair was pinned under a battered hat. She saw him coming across the grass, and her whole body went still in that particular way she had, like a hawk sighting movement below. He stopped 6 feet from her and held up one hand to show it was empty. "I'm not here to argue," he said. "And I didn't bring the ring." She studied him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Then what did you bring?" "A question," he said. "A different one." A pause. She turned back to the fence wire, began twisting 2 broken ends together with practiced efficiency. "All right," she said. He took a breath. "What was the hardest year of your life?" She went very still. The fence wire held its shape between her gloved hands. For a long moment there was nothing but the sound of wind moving through the dry grass and a meadowlark somewhere to the east singing its bright, indifferent song. Then she said, 1881. He waited. He had learned, watching her over 4 years, that Rosa Wells did not elaborate until she was ready. Rushing her was like trying to rush a river. "The drought," she said. "And my mother had died the previous autumn, so it was just me and my father. The cattle were dying. The grass was gone. My father was already sick, though we didn't know yet that it was his heart. And there were men, 3 separate men, who came to us that year and offered to buy us out." She paused. "They were not kind offers. Did you consider taking them?" "For about 4 minutes," she said. "Then I went and dug a second well instead." He felt that familiar shifting sensation in his chest, that recognition. "How did you know it would work?" She glanced at him sideways. The ghost of something that was almost amusement crossed her face. "I didn't." He nodded. He tipped his hat. "Thank you," he said. "That's all you wanted to know." "For today," he said. He walked back to his ranch. He sat on his porch and thought about a woman who would dig a second well into dry ground on 4 minutes of courage. He thought about what it meant to survive that way, and what kind of armor a person had to build to survive that way, and how that armor might look from the outside like distance. He went back the next day. She was in the barn that time, working with the sorrel horse she'd rescued 2 years back, the one that still sometimes startled at sudden movements and required, above all else, patience and consistency. Harlan stopped at the barn door and watched for a moment before she noticed him. She was speaking softly to the horse, her hand moving in slow circles on its neck, and the horse had its head lowered and its eyes half closed with something that was, he thought, the animal equivalent of trust. "Same deal as yesterday," he said. "Just a question." She didn't look at him. "Go on, then. What do you love most about this ranch?" She was quiet for a while. The horse blew softly through its nose. "The sky," she said. "My mother used to say we were rich in sky." She'd grown up in a valley in Sonora where the mountains crowded everything close. She came here and she said it was the first time in her life she could see all the way to the edges of things. A pause. "She's buried on the North Ridge. When I work the land I can always see where she is. That matters to me." Harlan was quiet. He thought about his own mother in Tennessee, alive last he'd heard, enduring weather the way mountains do. "That's a beautiful reason to stay somewhere," he said. Rosa glanced at him then, and something in her expression shifted. Just barely. The way the light shifts before a cloud crosses the sun, a subtle change that you have to be paying close attention to notice. "What do you love about your ranch?" she asked. He hadn't expected her to turn the question back on him. He almost deflected, almost gave her the easy, safe answer about the cattle prices or the soil quality in the eastern pasture. But she had given him something real, and he owed her the same. "The work," he said slowly. "When I'm working the land, I don't think about anything else. I'm not from here, not from the West, not from New Mexico. My past doesn't follow me out into the pastures. Out there, I'm just a man doing a job, and that's enough. That's more than enough." She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually did. Then she turned back to the horse. "See you tomorrow, Harlan Reed," she said. It was not permission. It was not an invitation. But it was not a refusal either. He went back every day for a week. On the third day he asked her what she read, because he had noticed the shelf of books near her fireplace on that disastrous afternoon and had recognized some titles he'd read himself. She told him she had read everything in the county library twice over, that she corresponded with a woman in Santa Fe who sent her new books when she could, that she was currently reading Mary Wollstonecraft and found her alternately inspiring and infuriating in the best possible way. On the fourth day he asked what she would do with her ranch if she could do anything at all, with no constraints. She surprised him. She said she wanted to breed horses, not just work animals. She wanted to build a reputation for producing horses with sound minds and good blood horses that ranchers and cavalry officers would ride hundreds of miles to acquire. Her father had started the ranch as a cattle operation because cattle were what the market demanded, but her real passion, her secret ambition, was horses. "Why haven't you started?" he asked. "Capital," she said flatly. "And the fact that every banker in Cimarron County looks at me and sees a woman with a Mexican father running a struggling ranch and decides before I open my mouth that I'm a bad investment." The bitterness in her voice was old and specific. This was not a fresh wound. This was scar tissue. "That's injustice," he said, because it was, and he was not going to pretend otherwise. "That's Tuesday in New Mexico territory," she said. On the fifth day he asked her what she missed most about her mother. She was quiet for such a long time he thought he had pushed too far, crossed some boundary he hadn't seen. Then she said, her voice at night, she used to sing. Not for company, just to herself while she was cooking or mending, little songs in Spanish. I didn't always know the words, but I knew what they meant by how they sounded. Some of them were about longing, some of them were about the land. She paused. "My Spanish isn't as good as it should be. My father spoke it, but my mother was the one who sang it, and after she died there was no one to sing it into me." Harlan said nothing for a moment. Then he said very carefully, "I'm sorry she's gone." And Rosa looked at him, and what he saw in her eyes was not the blazing fury he usually saw there, not the controlled distance, but something raw and undefended and so honest it almost made him look away. "Thank you," she said quietly. "People don't usually say that. They say she's in a better place, or they say she had a good life, or they say something about God's plan. You just said you were sorry she was gone. That's all it is," he said. "I'm sorry she's gone because you miss her, and because the world seems like a smaller thing without people like her in it." That evening, walking home, Harlan Reed felt something he had not expected to feel. He was learning more in these daily conversations than he had learned in 4 years of careful watching. Not because Rosa had been hiding herself. She hadn't been. Not exactly. But because he had never thought to ask. He had been so busy building his idea of her that he had never simply asked who she was. He was beginning to understand why she had said the wrong question. On the 6th day, he arrived to find her in a standoff. There was a man on horseback in her yard, and even before Harlan could hear the conversation clearly, the posture of both figures told him everything. Rosa rigid and upright on her porch steps, arms folded, chin elevated. The horseman leaning forward in his saddle with the relaxed arrogance of a man who believed his position gave him license. The man was Colt Denny, and Colt Denny was trouble in Cimarron County, the way drought was trouble, pervasive, anticipated, and deeply unfair to anyone it touched. He ran a large cattle operation to the north and had been quietly expanding his holdings for years, buying up struggling properties at distressed prices, and when purchase failed, applying various forms of pressure until the seller became more motivated. He had tried to buy Rosa's ranch in 1881, during the drought, and she had refused him. He had apparently not forgotten. Harlan approached at an unhurried walk, keeping his body language easy and his hand away from the revolver on his hip. He stopped beside Rosa's porch rail and looked up at Denny with an expression of mild, polite attention. "Morning, Colt," he said. Denny looked down at him. He was perhaps 40, red-faced and broad, with the thick certainty of a man who had never been seriously wrong about anything important. "Reed," he said, "didn't know you were calling on Miss Wells." "Just visiting," Harlan said. "Were you two in the middle of something? I can wait." It was a polite way of making himself immovable, and Denny understood it, and his jaw tightened. "I was making Miss Wells a business offer," Denny said. "A fair one." "I already told you what I thought of your offer," Rosa said. Her voice was flat and precise as a surveyor's line. "My answer is no, the same as it was last year and the year before." "Miss Wells," Denny said, dropping the easy tone and letting something harder underneath it show, "your well is running low. Your north pasture fence is in bad shape. You had a rough winter. I'm offering you a way out of a situation that's going to get worse before it gets better." "I've been in worse situations," Rosa said. "I know you think so," Denny said, and there was something in the words, a knowledge, a hidden motive barely covered, that made the back of Harlan's neck prickle. "But I wonder if you know everything about your current situation." "What does that mean?" Harlan asked, keeping his voice neutral. Denny smiled at him, and it was not a friendly smile. "Just that property matters can be complicated, especially when the original claims are old and possibly not as clean as they appear." He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away. Rosa said nothing for a long time after he was gone. Then she said very quietly, "He's been talking to someone at the land office." Harlan looked at her. "You know about this?" "I suspected it." She came down the porch steps and sat on the lowest one, and for a moment she looked tired in a way she usually didn't let herself look in front of anyone. "My parents' original land claim, my father filed it in 1865. There were irregularities in some of the federal recording during that period. Lost documents. Disputed surveys. Men like Denny have used those irregularities before to challenge ownership." She looked up at him. "I've been trying to get the documentation in order for 2 years, but the clerk at the land office is friendly with Denny," Harlan said. "Friendly with Denny," she confirmed. He sat down on the step beside her. There was less than a foot between them, and he was aware of that distance the way you are aware of a fire's warmth, not touching it, but knowing it was there. "What do you need?" he asked. She looked at him sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean to sort out the land claim. What do you need?" She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her trying to decide how to receive the offer, whether it was genuine, whether accepting it would cost her something. He recognized that calculation because he'd watched her make it before, with other people, and he understood now that it was not arrogance or stubbornness. It was the hard-learned wariness of a woman who had been let down enough times to know that help sometimes came with hidden costs. "I need someone to go to the territorial capital," she said. Santa Fe. The land records from that period were supposed to be duplicated at the federal level. If the copies exist, they would clear the claim entirely. "But I can't leave the ranch unattended." "I can go," he said. She looked at him fully then, and he met her eyes and held them and tried to put everything he meant into the steadiness of his gaze. "Why?" she asked. He thought about giving her a practical answer, something about neighboring properties and shared interests in water rights, and how Denny's expansion would be bad for every small rancher in the county. All of that was true. But she had asked him a real question, and by now he had committed himself to real answers. "Because I'm starting to understand what you're fighting for," he said. "And because watching someone fight alone when they don't have to is one of the things in this world I like least." She held his gaze for another long moment. Then she looked away, out across her dry, beautiful pastures, toward the north ridge where her mother's grave was. "All right," she said. The trip to Santa Fe took 3 days by horse, and Harlan made it in 2.5, leaving at dawn on a Saturday and riding hard through the high desert country, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains growing gradually larger ahead of him. He carried in his saddlebag a carefully written list of document references that Rosa had compiled, dates and filing numbers, and the names of the original surveyors, all of it organized with the same methodical intelligence she applied to everything. He also carried, because he had been thinking about it since the 3rd day of his questions, a list of things he didn't yet know about Rosa Wells that he wanted to ask. Santa Fe in the summer of 1884 was a city in the middle of becoming itself adobe, and new frame buildings mixed together. The old plaza anchoring a town that was reaching outward in all directions, drawn by the railroad that had arrived a few years prior, and changed everything about what the territory could be. Harlan found the Federal Land Records office on a side street off the plaza, and spent the better part of Sunday going through boxes of archived documents with a clerk who was initially unhelpful and became, after Harlan spent 15 minutes explaining exactly what he was looking for and why it mattered under federal homestead law, somewhat less unhelpful. The documents existed. Rosa's father had filed correctly in duplicate in September 1865. The federal copy was intact. The original survey coordinates were clear and unambiguous. The claim was as clean as a claim could be. Harlan had the relevant pages copied by the clerk, paid the fee, and was back on his horse before noon. He rode home faster than he had ridden out. He arrived at Rosa's ranch in the late afternoon of the 2nd day, rode dusty and tired and quietly triumphant. Rosa was on her porch, and she was on her feet before he had fully dismounted, her eyes going immediately to his saddlebag. "Well," she said. He pulled out the folded documents and held them out to her. She took them with hands that were not quite steady. She unfolded them and read. The late sun turned her face gold and copper, and he watched her as she read, watched the tension in her jaw slowly release, watched her shoulders drop by increments as the words resolved whatever dark fear she had been carrying. "It's here," she said. It came out as something very close to a whisper. "It's all there," he said, "clean and clear and double-filed." She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, and he thought she was going to say something important, something that matched the brightness in her eyes, but instead she pressed her lips together and nodded. "Come inside," she said. "You need water and food, and so does your horse." He tended to his horse first because that was the right order, and then he came into her kitchen and she put a plate of food in front of him and poured water from a clay jug and sat across from him while he ate. It was the most ordinary thing, 2 people at a table in the early evening, and it felt, to Harlan, like something he had been hungry for without knowing how to name the hunger. "I have a question for you," she said. He looked up from his plate. "You've been asking me questions every day for almost 2 weeks," she said. "Do you want to tell me what you're doing?" He set down his fork. "I think you know what I'm doing." "Want to hear you say it." He considered his words. "I was so sure I knew who you were that I never asked. I built an image of you, and then I brought you a ring I'd been carrying for 3 weeks and expected you to fit the image. That was foolish and unfair. And when you said I was asking the wrong question, I finally understood what I'd been doing wrong." He paused. "So I'm asking better questions instead." She was quiet. The evening was cooling, and the light was going golden through the window. "What do you want from me, Harlan?" "Right now, I just want to know you. The real you, not the idea I had of you." A pause. "Whatever comes after that, I'll let that be what it is." She looked at him for a long time. He had the sense, as he sometimes did with Rosa Wells, of standing before a door that was very heavy and had been sealed shut for a long time, and of not knowing whether it would open. Then she said, "My mother was afraid of lightning, terrified of it. She'd grown up in a country where a man had been killed by it during a storm, and she'd never recovered from the sight of it. So every time there was a storm, she would sit in the center of the house with a blanket around her shoulders, and she would be afraid. And my father would sit beside her, not talking, not trying to explain that lightning was unlikely to kill her, just sitting beside her in the dark." Just there she paused. "I used to watch them and think it was the most loving thing I had ever seen. He didn't try to fix her fear, he just stayed in it with her." Harlan was very still. He understood that she was telling him something enormous, that she had wrapped it in a story about her parents because that was the only way she knew to offer it. "That's what you want," he said, "not a question, an understanding." "I've had people offer to fix things for me my whole life," she said. "Or try to. Or assume they know what I need without asking. My father was the only man I ever knew who sat in the dark with someone without trying to change anything about it." She met his eyes. "You went to Santa Fe. You fixed the land problem. I'm grateful for that, Harlan, genuinely, more than I can tell you. But what I'm saying is, the ring wasn't the wrong question because of what it was," he said slowly. "It was the wrong question because of how I came to it, because I didn't earn it. I hadn't sat in any dark with you." The word earn was not quite right. He knew love was not something earned like wages, but the understanding behind it was right, and she could see that he understood because the brightness came back into her eyes. "Yes," she said. He finished his meal. She walked him to the door, and on the porch they stood for a moment in the violet evening, with the first stars appearing over the mesa wall and the air smelling of dust and sage and the particular dryness of a New Mexico summer night. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. For the first time, the very first time he could remember, in 4 years of carefully watching Rosa Wells, she smiled at him. It was not the controlled, public expression she wore at county meetings. It was small and real and a little uncertain, and it was the most beautiful thing Harlan Reed had ever seen. "Same time tomorrow," she said. Over the next 2 weeks, things shifted. The questions continued, but they became less formal. They stopped being a protocol and became simply how Harlan and Rosa talked to each other. He would arrive in the morning, and she would be doing some piece of ranch work, and he would find something to help with. And as they worked, they would talk real talk, the kind that goes below the surface of weather and cattle prices and reaches the country underneath. He learned that she had a fierce, dry sense of humor that she deployed rarely and to devastating effect. He learned that she was a gifted sketch artist, filling notebooks with detailed drawings of horses and the landscape around her, though she considered it a private thing and not an accomplishment. He learned that she had once, at 17, run away to Taos for 3 days because she had wanted to see the pueblo and had known her father would worry too much to let her go, and that she still felt guilty about those 3 days even though the pueblo had been everything she had hoped. She learned things about him too. He told her about Tennessee, about his father's rages and his mother's endurance, about the day at 19 when he had stood in the kitchen doorway watching his father berate his mother over a spilled jar of molasses, and had felt, for the first time with absolute clarity, that this was not the life he was going to live. He told her about coming west with $30 and a carpet bag, and the particular terror and exhilaration of a complete beginning. He told her that he had been lonely in New Mexico in a way he hadn't expected, that he had thought freedom would feel like fullness, but sometimes it felt like empty space, and that it had taken him years to understand the difference between solitude chosen and solitude suffered. "Do you still feel that way?" she asked. They were sitting on her porch in the evening and the stars were coming out and her hands were folded in her lap. "Less and less," he said, and did not look away from the stars. She did not answer that, but he felt her shift slightly in her chair toward him, just barely, just the inclination of a few degrees, and he counted that as more than words. Colt Denny came back. He came on a Thursday afternoon, and this time he did not come alone. He brought a man with him, thin, pale, dressed in the manner of a lawyer or a clerk, carrying a leather document case. They pulled up in front of Rosa's house, and Denny called out in a voice designed to carry to every corner of the property. Rosa came to the door. Harlan, who had been helping her repair a section of roof on the barn, came around the side of the building and stood at the corner. "I've brought someone from the county land office," Denny said. "There are some irregularities in your title that need to be addressed." "There are no irregularities in my title," Rosa said. She said it with complete calm. She walked down her porch steps and stood in the yard with her arms at her sides and her chin level. "I have the federal land record copies documenting my father's original claim, clean and clear." The thin man's confidence wavered. He glanced at Denny. "Where did you get those?" Denny asked. His voice had gone flat. "From the Federal Records Office in Santa Fe," Harlan said from the corner of the barn, "where they've been filed since September 1865, alongside the territorial copy that I assume you somehow arranged to misplace." Denny looked at him. There was a calculation happening behind those flat eyes, a rapid reassessment of what he was dealing with, of whether the threat was still viable, of what his next move should be. Harlan watched it happen and kept his own face neutral and still. "This isn't finished," Denny said. "It is, actually," Harlan said, "because those documents are now also registered with the circuit court in Taos, where Judge Voss has reviewed them and confirmed the title. I made that stop on the way back from Santa Fe." This was a slight expansion of the truth. He had written to Judge Voss from Santa Fe, but the confirmation had arrived by telegraph 2 days ago, but the effect was accurate. "If you file any challenge to Miss Wells's title, you'll be filing it against a federally and judicially confirmed claim. The man who does that in this county is going to find the rest of the small ranchers paying very close attention to his other land dealings." It was not a threat exactly. It was a description of consequences, which was a different thing, and Denny knew the difference, and the difference mattered to Denny. He turned his horse. The thin man followed. Rosa waited until they were out of sight. Then she turned and looked at Harlan with an expression that contained several things at once: gratitude and something else, something warmer and more complicated. "You went to the circuit court," she said. "I wrote to them from Santa Fe. The telegraph came back 2 days ago." He came across the yard toward her. "I was going to tell you, but I didn't want to. I didn't want it to seem like I was handling things for you. The land is yours and the protection is yours. I just made some arrangements." "Without telling me," she said. He stopped. This was the edge of something. He could feel it. "Yes," he said. "I should have told you. I should have asked what you wanted before I wrote to Voss." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did it occur to you to ask me first?" "Yes," he said honestly. "And then I thought he might move fast, Denny, and the protection needed to be in place before he did. So I made the call." He paused. "I was wrong to do it without telling you. Even if the timing was right, the method was wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding whether to be angry about the method or grateful for the result, and then he saw her set both aside and simply look at him clearly. "You were trying to protect me," she said. "Yes. But you don't need me to protect you without asking you first." "No," she said. "I don't." A pause, "but I appreciate that you understood that." "I'm learning," he said. Something in her face changed then. It was the same shift as before, the same door moving on its heavy hinges, but this time it moved further. She looked at him with something nakedly open in her expression, something that in a person less guarded would have been easy to read from across a room. She took one step toward him, just one, and then she stopped as if she wasn't sure what came next. He stood perfectly still, the way you stand when something rare and easily startled is deciding whether or not to trust you. "Harlan," she said. "Yes, I think," she stopped. "I think you might be," she stopped again. He waited. "I think I was wrong," she finally said, "that you don't know me." His chest expanded with something so fierce it almost hurt. "You were right the first time," he said gently. "I didn't. I was wrong about that, but I'm learning." "You are," she said. "You're learning faster than anyone ever has." And then, because they were both standing in a yard in the late afternoon sun with the dust still settling from Denny's horses and the mesa wall blood-red in the western light, and because there was a moment between them that both of them could feel, she reached out and took his hand. Not a romantic gesture, practical almost, just the warm clasp of her fingers around his, like she was steadying herself or steadying him or both. He held her hand and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would be better than this. They stood like that for a minute, maybe two, then she let go. "I need to finish the barn roof," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll help." They went back to work, but everything was different now. The third week of Harlan's questions was different in texture from the first two. The distance between them had been closing gradually, the way a shoreline approaches when you're sailing so slowly at first that you don't notice, and then suddenly it's right there, specific and real and full of detail. He started teaching her to play chess. She had a board that had belonged to her mother, the pieces carved from dark and light wood in the Spanish style, and it turned out she had a natural instinct for the game that she had never been able to express because there had been no one to teach her the structure. Within 3 evenings she was playing him to a standstill, and within a week she beat him twice, and his annoyance at losing was so perfectly balanced by his delight at watching her think that he could barely tell the two feelings apart. She showed him her drawings. Not all of them, she was selective, and he understood that the selection itself was an act of trust, but enough that he began to understand how she saw the world. Her sketches were precise and unsentimental. The horses were captured mid-motion, their muscles and movement exact. The landscapes had a quality of clarity that felt less like observation and more like analysis. The arroyos and mesas and dry grass rendered with the same intelligent attention she gave to everything. "These should be seen by more people," he said. "They're for me," she said, but she looked pleased and she didn't close the notebook. On the 19th day since the proposal, he came to find her sitting at her kitchen table with a letter in her hand and a look on her face that made him slow his steps crossing the porch. "Bad news?" he asked. She looked up. "Mrs. Alcott, the woman in Santa Fe who sends me books, she's ill. Seriously, it sounds like. This is from her daughter. She asked if anyone would be willing to travel to see her." She set the letter down. "She was a friend to my mother. They corresponded for 20 years. She's the reason I read the things I read." A pause. "She might be dying. Can you go?" She gestured at the ranch around them. "Who watches this?" He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "I can watch it," he said, "for a few days. I know your routines well enough by now, and my own operation can manage short-handed for a short stretch." She looked at him. The wariness was there, but fainter than it used to be. "That's a significant thing to ask of someone," she said. "You've been doing this alone for 3 years," he said. "You don't have to do everything alone." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "If I ask you to water the north pasture horses first thing every morning before anything else, first thing every morning, north pasture horses, and the sorrel in the barn needs to be handled gently. No sudden movements. I know," he said. "I've watched you with him." She looked at him across the table. He looked back. The afternoon was quiet around them, the kind of deep summer quiet that feels like the land itself holding its breath. "All right," she said. She left 2 days later, early in the morning, carrying a small bag and wearing her better dress, a dark green cotton that made her look formal and capable at once. Harlan stood in her yard and she stood on her porch steps, and they looked at each other across that small distance. "I'll be 3 days, maybe 4, she said. "I'll be here," he said. She started down the steps, then stopped. She turned back toward him and he saw that she was deciding something. He could always see it in the set of her shoulders when she was deciding something. "Harlan," she said. "Yes." "When I come back," she paused. "I'd like you to come to dinner, a proper dinner, not you helping me with ranch work and eating what I feed you because you were already here." She looked at him steadily. "A dinner that I prepare specifically for you because I want you to come." He felt the meaning of it move through him like warm water. "I would like that very much," he said. She nodded. She walked down the steps and across the yard to where her horse was tied, and she mounted in one smooth motion and rode away down the red dirt road. He watched her go, the green dress and the dark horse and the enormous New Mexico sky above it all, and he stood watching until she was a small dark figure at the far edge of his vision, and then he turned to tend her horses. He took care of her ranch with the same meticulous attention she gave it herself. The north pasture horses first thing every morning. The sorrel handled gently, spoken to softly, given extra time. The fence line in the south pasture, which had developed another weakness since the last repair, shored up with new wire from her supply shed. The garden behind the house watered in the evening when the sun was low. He found small things to fix, things that weren't urgent but that he knew she'd noticed and been meaning to address, and he addressed them. On the second evening he was alone in her kitchen, eating a plain supper he'd made himself from her stores, and he looked around the room at the books on the shelf, and the sketch notebook on the side table, and the clay jug she kept her water in, and the hook by the door where her working hat hung, and he felt, in the quietest possible way, at home. This surprised him, because the word home was one he had been careful with since Tennessee. He had made a home at his own ranch through sheer determination, the way you clear rocks from a field one at a time, by force. But this feeling was different. It was not something he had built by effort. It was something he was simply in. He sat with the feeling for a while, turning it over carefully the way he had been turning her words over since the day she said the wrong question. Then he went to bed, and he slept better than he had in months. She came back on the 4th day, late in the afternoon. He was in the barn with the sorrel when he heard the horse on the road, and he came out to the yard and she was dismounting at the gate, a little dusty and a little tired, and she looked across the yard at him with an expression that was, he realized with a start, glad. Simply, plainly glad to see him. "How is she?" he asked. "Better than the letter suggested," Rosa said. "She was already improving when I arrived. She said my mother would be furious at her for scaring me." A pause, and something moved across her face that was grief and affection together. "We talked for 2 days, about my mother and about books and about all sorts of things. It was," she stopped. "It was like having a small piece of her back." He nodded. He didn't try to say anything that would diminish it. "How is the ranch?" she asked. "Come and see," he said. He walked her around the patched south fence, the watered garden, the Rashad horse whose shoe had been loose but not quite urgent enough for her to have addressed before she left. She walked behind him and said nothing, but he could hear in her silence that particular quality of being surprised, not by the practical things themselves but by the care that had gone into them, the attention to what she would have done and what she would have wanted. When they came back to the porch, she sat down on the steps and he sat beside her, and the sun was going down behind the mesa, and the sky was all orange and purple, and the air was beginning to cool. "You took good care of things," she said. "I tried," he said. She turned to look at him. She was closer than she usually sat beside him, close enough that he could see the details of her face with the particular clarity of late light, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the single silver thread in her dark hair that hadn't been there a year ago, the small scar on her chin from, she had told him on the 8th day of questions, a fall from a horse at age 12. "Harlan," she said. "Yes. What is the question you most want to ask me right now?" He knew the answer immediately, but he took his time before speaking. "I want to ask, he said. Whether any of this, these weeks, these conversations, whether any of this has changed anything for you. In how you see me. She was quiet for a moment. The last light was holding in the sky, that long, gorgeous suspension before dark falls. It hasn't changed how I see you, she said. It's changed what I see. What do you see now that you didn't before? A man who is willing to be wrong about himself, she said. That's rare. She paused. I see someone who listens not to know what to say next, but because he actually wants to understand. I see someone who came to my porch with a ring and, when I said no, went home and thought about why instead of deciding I was the problem. He looked at her. Most men would have decided you were the problem, he said. Most men would have, she agreed. You didn't. The sky above them was darkening from orange to deep violet. A coyote somewhere to the east made its first evening sound, a single brief note of wildness in the cooling air. She reached over and took his hand again, the same practical clasp as before, but this time she held it differently, not as a steadying but as a holding, a deliberate keeping. I'd like to answer your question, she said, but I'd like to answer it properly. How is properly? She turned toward him on the step, and she lifted her free hand and touched his jaw, the light touch of her fingertips against the rough edge of his face, and looked at him from very close, and she said, very quietly, like this. And she kissed him. It was a careful kiss, tentative, honest as everything else about her, an asking rather than a taking. He answered it with the same care, one hand moving to cup the side of her face with a gentleness that cost him some effort because what he felt was not gentle exactly, but enormous and full and so long in arriving that the arrival itself was almost overwhelming. She pulled back and looked at him. They were both very still. That, she said, is what has changed. He kept hold of her hand. She let him. They sat on her porch steps until full dark had fallen, and the stars were out in the spectacular abundance of a New Mexico summer night. And they talked about small things, ordinary things, the kind of talk that happens when two people have passed some threshold and no longer need to measure what they give each other. He told her a story about a mule he'd owned in his first year in New Mexico that had been, he was convinced, philosophically opposed to physical labor. She laughed, a real laugh, unreserved, and the sound of it made him feel that he had achieved something more significant than the Santa Fe trip, than the circuit court registration, than any practical thing he had done. He went home very late that night, walking back under the stars, and he thought about what she had said. Not changed how I see you, changed what I see. He was, he realized, happy. Not satisfied, not content, not the cautious, neutral state he had been living in for 6 years in New Mexico. Happy. As in, alive and glad of it, and full of something that wanted to be larger. The dinner she had promised came 3 days later. She met him at the door in a dress he had not seen before, dark red cotton, simple, not formal exactly, but clearly chosen with some care. Her hair was down, which he had only seen twice before, and it fell past her shoulders in a dark wave, and he had to consciously redirect his attention to her face, which was not exactly a hardship. The kitchen smelled of roasting chicken and green chilies, and something with cinnamon that turned out to be a rice pudding made from her mother's recipe. The table was set with a cloth he had not seen before, and the clay water jug had been replaced by the glass pitcher she apparently kept for occasions. You look, he said, and then stopped, because every word he could think of felt either too small or too much. She tilted her head. You look like you, he said. But the version of you that you're choosing to show me, and that's, he paused. That's the most beautiful thing, Rosa. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she turned back to the stove and made a small sound that he suspected was her trying to control the expression on her face. He sat down and let her have that moment in privacy. They ate together, and it was everything that word together could be when two people had spent a month learning each other. Not side by side in parallel like strangers sharing a space, but oriented toward each other, filling in the silences with the ease of people who are no longer afraid of what the silences might reveal. After the dishes were cleared and the lamp was burning low, she brought out the chess board. One game, she said. "You're going to beat me again," he said. "Probably," she agreed. "But try anyway." He lost, but it took her 40 minutes, and when she finally had him, he saw the move 2 turns too late and felt a clean, honest annoyance that made her laugh, and then he laughed too. "You're getting harder to beat," she said, studying the board. "You're getting better faster than I'm improving," he said. "That's not a criticism. That's just you're extraordinary at things." She looked at him across the chess board. Her expression was open in a way that still startled him sometimes, this woman who had been so closed for so long. "You're the first person," she said, "who says things like that to me without then following it with something you want." He thought about that. "I want plenty of things," he said, "but the wanting doesn't have conditions." She reached across the board and touched his hand. "I know," she said. A month had passed since he had walked into her kitchen with that ring. 1 month of different questions. He had the ring still on the shelf above his fireplace, catching the light each evening when he came in. He had not forgotten about it. But he had let himself stop reaching for it, in the way you let yourself stop favoring an old wound when it has fully healed. He did not plan what happened next. It was a Sunday morning, and he had come over early to help Rosa move a section of fence, and they had been working for 2 hours in the growing heat when she handed him the water canteen and sat down in the shade of the fence post, and he sat beside her, and they drank the cool water in turns, and the sky was cloudless and enormous and the mesa was rust-red and precise against the blue. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always," he said. "What do you want your life to look like?" "Not the ranch, I know about the ranch. The rest of it, 10 years from now, what do you see?" He turned the canteen in his hands. This was the real question, he knew. This was her version of the question that had brought him back every day for a month. "I see someone to eat breakfast with," he said. "Someone to talk to in the evenings. Someone whose opinion I care about and whose judgment I respect and who will tell me plainly when I'm wrong." He paused. "I see horses. Better horses than either of us has now, because the person I eat breakfast with knows more about horses than anyone in the territory." Another pause. "I see children, maybe, if they want to be here." He looked at her sideways. "Do you see any of that?" She was quiet for a moment. The meadowlark was at it again somewhere in the grass, bright and persistent. "I see more than that," she said. "I see all of that, and then I see something harder to name. A foundation. Something that was built slowly and correctly, not rushed, not assumed. Something that knows what it is because both people know what the other person actually is and not just who they imagine them to be." He set the canteen down in the dry grass. "Rosa," he said. "Yes. I have a question to ask you. I've been asking questions for a month." He looked at her and he was careful. He was so careful now about what he asked and how he asked it, about the difference between questions that come from your own wants and questions that come from actually seeing the other person. "This one is different from all the others, but I want to ask it the right way, so let me try to get the words right." She turned toward him. Her eyes were steady on his. "I know what you've been through," he said. "I know what it cost you to trust anyone with any part of yourself after your mother died, and your father got sick, and men like Denny tried to turn your vulnerability into leverage. I know that you are capable of everything your life requires and that you don't need me in any practical sense." He paused. "I know that you like to dig second wells on 4 minutes of courage. I know you talk to the sorrow like he's a person because you figured out that he needs to be talked to like a person. I know your mother feared lightning and your father sat in the dark with her, and I know that's the kind of love you understand and the only kind you'll accept." He stopped, took a breath. "So my question isn't what I asked before. It's not a question about rings or marriage or any particular arrangement. It's simpler than all of that." He looked at her, this woman he had been learning for a month, this woman he had been watching for 4 years before that, this woman who had said the wrong question and given him the most important gift of his life without meaning to. "Do you want to build something with me?" he asked. "Not because you need to, but because you want to," the meadowlark sang. The sun was at its high point and the heat was pressing down, and the red mesa stood against the sky with the patient permanence of something that has been asked nothing of and given everything. Rosa Wells looked at Harlan Reed for a long, unhurried moment. He saw the door behind her eyes, the heavy door that had been moving on its hinges for a month. He saw it open. "Yes," she said, "I do." He reached into his shirt pocket, not for the ring, which was still on his shelf at home, but for nothing, because there was nothing to produce, no token and no transaction, just himself and the answer she had given him. "Yes," he said, because it needed to be said in both directions. She leaned forward and kissed him again, and this time it was not careful or tentative, but full and real and very warm. And his hand moved to the back of her neck, and her hands pressed flat against his chest. And they sat in the dry grass in the New Mexico sun in the shade of a fence post. They had just repaired together, and they were, both of them, plainly and without qualification, exactly where they wanted to be. He went home that afternoon and took the ring off the shelf and put it in his pocket. Not to give it to her today, probably not tomorrow, but because the moment would come and he would know it when it came, and he wanted to be ready. The moment came 6 weeks later in the most ordinary possible way. They were in her kitchen after dinner, and she was reading aloud to him. From one of the books, Mrs. Alcott had sent a collection of poetry that she found simultaneously beautiful and occasionally overwrought. And he was watching her face as she read, the animation in it, the small precise expressions that crossed her face as she encountered a line she loved or one she thought was excessive. The lamp was warm between them, and outside it was raining, a rare summer evening rain in New Mexico, gentle and extraordinary, making the air smell of wet sage and grateful earth. He reached into his pocket. She looked up from the book and saw the ring and went very still. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he said. "I think this might be it." She set the book down. She looked at the ring, the silver band, the turquoise stone, the warm metal he had carried so long. "That's the same ring," she said. "It is. You kept it." "I was hoping you'd change your mind," he said. "Or rather, I was hoping I'd earn the right to ask the right question." He paused. "I know now that I have." She looked at him across the lamplight with her eyes full of that brightness again, that openness. "You've known for 6 weeks," she said. "Why did you wait?" "Because I was enjoying being exactly where we were," he said, "and I didn't want to reach for the next thing before I'd finished being grateful for this thing." She was quiet for a moment. Then she reached out and took the ring from his palm. She looked at it for a long time. He waited because he had learned how to wait for Rosa Wells. Then she slipped it onto her own finger. "You didn't ask," she said. There was something dancing at the edges of her expression. "No," he said. "I figured you'd let me know what you thought." She held out her hand, the ring on it, and looked at it with an expression that contained everything: the 4 years, the month of questions, the afternoon in the dry grass, the chess games, the Santa Fe trip, the evening her mother sang in Spanish and her father sat in the dark. "It fits," she said. "It fits," he confirmed. She looked up at him. "Yes," she said. "Since apparently I still have to say it, yes." He leaned across the table and kissed her, and outside the rain came down on the grateful New Mexico earth, and the lamp burned warm between them. They were married in October, when the aspens in the Sangre de Cristos had turned gold, and the air had the sharp, clean quality of the first cold. The ceremony was small: a circuit preacher, a handful of neighbors, the widow Carmichael who had lent Harlan her iron for the shirt he'd worn the day of the first proposal, and who cried throughout the second one with a cheerful disregard for her own dignity. Rosa wore her mother's best shawl, cream and gold, embroidered with small flowers in the old style, over a dress of dark blue cotton. She had her hair up, with a small white flower tucked into it that Harlan had found growing near the creek that morning and placed in her hair before she could say it was impractical. She let him do it, which he understood meant something. He had prepared a statement, the night before, about what he intended to be as her husband. He had written it out and then thrown it away because the writing made it sound like a legal document, and he had tried again and thrown that away too. In the end, before the preacher and the widow Carmichael and their small gathering of witnesses, when the preacher asked if he had words, he said simply, "I'm going to keep asking better questions. For the rest of my life, Rosa looked at him, and the brightness in her eyes was absolute. "I'm going to keep answering them," she said. "Honestly, even when you don't like the answers." "Especially then," he said. The preacher said the words, and they said the words back. And when it was done and Harlan kissed his wife for the first time as her husband, the widow Carmichael wept harder, and one of the neighboring ranchers, a taciturn man named Buell, who had never to anyone's knowledge expressed an emotion, was observed to blow his nose very thoroughly into his bandana. Colt Denny, in the weeks following the confirmation of Rosa's title and the knowledge that it was registered with the circuit court, had made 2 more quiet attempts through intermediaries to acquire the Wells property. Both times Rosa had responded through a letter written in her precise, unsparing style that made it clear she understood exactly what was being attempted and why it would fail. The third time, Harlan had gone to see Denny himself, alone, on a Tuesday morning. He had not gone with a gun, or with threats, or with anything except the simple and verifiable facts of Rosa's position legally, judicially, and practically, and the equally simple and verifiable fact that Harlan Reed had filed a detailed account of Denny's previous conduct with both the circuit court and the territorial land commissioner, copies of which were held by Judge Voss and 2 other parties, and which would be released should any further interference with the Wells property occur. Denny had listened. His jaw had worked, and then he had, apparently deciding that the cost was too high and the prize too protected, turned his attentions elsewhere. This was not justice. The injustice of what he had tried to do, the exploitation of bureaucratic confusion to steal a woman's inherited land, the corruption of a county clerk, the targeting of a property specifically because its owner was a woman with a Mexican father who could be pressured from multiple directions. That injustice sat in the county like a stone that hadn't been moved, and they both knew it. Rosa talked about it sometimes, in her clear and unsentimental way, as one of the 10,000 ways the territory ground down people who deserved better. What they had done was protect their specific corner of it. The larger stone remained. "Someday," Rosa said once, sitting on their porch in the evening, "there will be law that doesn't need a Harlan Reed to make it work for a Rosa Wells." "Yes," Harlan said, "there should be, and it should have existed already." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "But I'm not entirely sorry you were here to make it work in the meantime." "I'm not entirely sorry either," he said. In the first year of their marriage, they merged the 2 operations carefully, thinking through each decision together with the same methodical attention they had been bringing to things since the month of questions. The cattle side of the ranch was consolidated under Harlan's management, with Rosa's full involvement in the strategic decisions. The north pasture of the Wells property, good grass, reliable water from the second well she had dug in 1881, became the beginning of what Rosa had always wanted, a horse breeding operation. It started small. She purchased 2 mares at the spring horse fair in Cimarron, sound animals of good blood that she had been watching for months, knowing their lineages and their temperaments with a specificity that astonished the sellers, who had not expected the young woman in the dark green dress to know what she knew. She bred them to a stallion owned by a rancher near Rayado who respected what she was building and gave her a fair price. The first foals arrived the following spring. They were extraordinary. Not immediately recognizable as extraordinary, they were young and leggy and uncertain on the world, the way foals always are. But Rosa watched them with the eye of someone who understood what she was looking at, and Harlan watched Rosa watch the foals, and he understood something fundamental. This was what she had been born to do. This was the work she had been practicing for every year she had spent managing and nursing and understanding horses, every sketch in every notebook, every conversation with the sorrel who had needed to be talked to like a person. Word began to spread. By the following fall, a rancher from Mora County arrived at their gate asking to see the stock. By the winter after that, a cavalry officer from Fort Union made the trip specifically to evaluate their 2-year-olds. The cavalry officer, a Captain Whitfield, a careful man who rode well and knew horses, spent an afternoon with Rosa on the north pasture. Harlan watched from a distance, not interfering, because Rosa did not need anyone to speak for her in her own domain. At the end of the afternoon, Captain Whitfield bought 2 horses and put in an advance order for 2 more from the next crop, and shook Rosa's hand as though she were an equal, because in the matter of horses she was more than an equal, and he was knowledgeable enough to understand it. As he rode away, Rosa came back to where Harlan was standing, and there was something in her face he had not seen before, not quite pride exactly, but the specific deep satisfaction of a person who has done a hard thing well, who has built something real in a world that told them the building was impossible. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She looked at the north pasture, at the young horses moving in the afternoon light, at the ranch her mother had loved and her father had fought to keep, and she had fought to keep after him, at the second well she had dug on 4 minutes of courage. "My mother would have liked this," she said. "She would have loved it," he said. Rosa looked at him then with the fullness of her regard, that complete, direct, honest attention that was one of the things he loved most about her, that had startled him the first time she directed it at him with warmth instead of wariness. "I love you," she said. She said it plainly, without ceremony, the way she said everything important stripped of decoration, direct to the core. "I love you," he said, with the same plainness, because that was how they spoke to each other, and how they would always speak to each other. A year into the marriage, on a night in late November when the first real cold had come down from the mountains, and the stars were brilliant and hard above the high desert, Rosa told him she was expecting. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with his boots in his hands, and she told him, and he set the boots down very carefully on the floor and sat there for a moment with his hands on his knees. "Say something," she said. She was watching him from across the room with an expression that was composed on the surface and not quite composed underneath. "I'm trying to find the words," he said. I'm not a man with quick words, you know that." "I know that," she said. "I'm trying to say," he said slowly, "that I didn't know until about 4 minutes ago that I was this happy. I knew I was happy. I didn't know there was a room behind the room, and now there is." She sat down beside him on the bed. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat in the cold November night with that particular quality of silence that is not empty but full of something coming, something beginning, something that they would meet together. The baby came in late July, in the heat of a New Mexico summer, with the sorrel horse standing patient in his stall 20 yards from the house, and the meadowlark singing in the south pasture, and the mesa wall red and permanent against the blue sky. It was a long labor, and it frightened Harlan in ways that he would only be able to articulate much later. The fear of losing her, the fear of loss so large and specific that it made everything else he had ever feared feel approximate by comparison. But Rosa was strong. Rosa was the kind of strong that had dug a second well and stood down a crooked land dealer and rebuilt her herd from nothing, and learned to love a man who had first come to her with the wrong question. And when it was over she was tired and safe and holding a son. A boy with dark hair and already something unmistakably alert in his eyes. They named him Miguel, for Rosa's father. And as a middle name they gave him the name Wells, carrying forward the name that Rosa's father had taken, and that Rosa had carried as her own name for 30 years, carrying it forward into the next generation, letting it mean something beyond its origins, letting it be the foundation of something new. Miguel Wells Reed. Harlan held him on the second day, sitting in the chair by the window, and the baby was astonishingly small and complete and already working on some private calculation with his face. Harlan looked at him for a long time, this new person, this whole fact of a person who had not existed. "He has your forehead," Rosa said from the bed, watching them. "What's wrong with my forehead?" "Nothing," she said. "I like your forehead." He looked up at her, and she was tired and radiant in the particular way of women who have just done something enormous, and she was looking at him and the baby with an expression that was, he thought, carefully, the most important thing he had ever been looked at with. He was 30 years old, sitting in a chair in New Mexico with his wife recovering in the bed behind him and his son figuring out the world in his arms, and he thought, "This is what I came west for. This right here." He hadn't known it coming west. He had known he was running from something, had known he needed space and distance, and a chance to become something other than the man his father's house was making him. He had not known that what he was running toward was this specific room, this specific woman, this specific small person with his forehead and Rosa's dark hair. He had not known. But he had been stubborn enough to stay and quiet enough to watch, and finally humble enough to understand that watching was not the same as knowing, and that knowing required asking better questions. Harlan put Miguel Wells' Reed very carefully on his chest, supporting the baby's impossible small head with the palm of one hand, and the baby made a small sound of either protest or satisfaction, hard to tell which at this age, and settled. "Thank you," Harlan said to Rosa. "For what?" "For saying no," he said. "The first time." She was quiet for a moment. Then she laughed, that real, unguarded laugh that he was still not entirely used to even after all this time, and she said, "Someone had to." The years that followed were not without hardship, because nothing in New Mexico territory in the 1880s was without hardship. There were bad winters and dry summers and cattle losses, and the complicated arithmetic of running two adjoining properties as one operation while maintaining the separate identities of both. There were years when the horse operation barely broke even, and years when it made more than either of them had projected. There was an outbreak of horse sickness in the fall of 1887 that threatened the entire breeding program and required 3 weeks of the most intensive animal nursing either of them had ever done, side by side in the barn through nights that were cold and frightening. And at the end of it, they had saved most of the stock and lost 2 horses and stood in the barn doorway in the early morning, with the sunrise coming up red over the mesa, and both of them so tired they could barely stand. "We got them through," Rosa said. "Most of them," he said. "Most of them," she confirmed. And then she leaned against him, and he held her up, and they watched the sun come up over the land they had built together. Miguel grew into a boy who had his mother's intelligence and his father's quietness, and a stubbornness that appeared to be entirely his own. He was interested in everything, the horses above all, which pleased Rosa enormously, but also in the mechanics of the new machinery that was beginning to arrive in the territory, and in mathematics, and in a fierce way in why things were the way they were, and whether they should be different. He asked at age 7 why some of the men who brought their horses to the north pasture for breeding spoke to his mother differently than they spoke to his father, and why some of them spoke past her to his father even when she was the one who knew the answer. Rosa looked at him steadily and said, "Because some people have not yet learned to look carefully at who they're actually talking to." "Is that always the reason?" he asked. "No," she said. "Sometimes it's because they've decided before looking that they already know, and that's a habit that will cost you everything if you let it grow in you." She paused. "You will meet people who decide what you are before they know you. When you do, you can choose to prove them wrong over and over until you're exhausted, or you can choose to do your work well and let the work be its own answer." Miguel thought about this. "Which one do you do?" he asked. "Both," she said, "depending on the day and the person and what I have left in me." He nodded with the absolute gravity of a 7-year-old processing something important. Harlan, who had been listening from the barn doorway, felt that familiar shifting in his chest, the recognition that had never entirely left him. 4 years of watching and then these years of knowing. This woman. This extraordinary, honest, unsparing woman. In the spring of 1889, Rosa told him about the second baby. This one came in December, a winter baby, born in a snowstorm, which Rosa said was appropriate given the circumstances of the conception, which had been on a cold evening in the spring with the fire burning and Miguel asleep down the hall and the two of them talking quietly about everything and nothing, the way they did in the evenings, and then not talking. A daughter this time. They named her Alina, for Rosa's mother, the woman who had sung in Spanish and had feared lightning, and had been loved in the dark by a man who understood that sitting with someone's fear was more important than explaining why the fear was unreasonable. Alina Rosa Reed, named for the singing, carrying the Spanish heart of it, even if the name itself was English. She came into the world as though she had been waiting, impatient, as though she had things to do and was not pleased about the delay. She was dark-eyed and vehement, and within about 3 days, clearly running the household on her own terms. Miguel regarded her with a mixture of fascination and wariness that Harlan found completely understandable. "She's loud," Miguel observed on the second day. "She knows what she wants," Rosa said. "How does she know what she wants? She's 2 days old." "Some people come in already knowing," Rosa said. She looked at Harlan over Miguel's head, and he looked back at her with full understanding. They were both thinking of the turquoise ring on the kitchen floor. They were both thinking of the wrong question and the month of better ones. They were both thinking of the door that had been heavy and sealed for a long time, opening slowly, opening now for good. He walked to where she sat with Alina in her arms and Miguel leaning against her knee, and he bent down and kissed his wife's temple, and she leaned her head briefly against his chest, and the baby made a sound of absolute objection to being crowded, and Miguel said with clinical interest, "She really is extremely loud." And Rosa laughed, and Harlan laughed, and even Alina, after a moment of outrage, seemed to accept the situation. There is a photograph, taken in 1891 at a photographer's studio in Cimarron. Photography had come to the county by then, one of the many things changing in the territory as the decade wore on. The 4 of them are in it. Rosa seated, her hands folded in her lap with the ring visible on her finger, wearing her dark dress with her hair up. Harlan standing behind her, one hand on the back of her chair. Miguel standing very straight at 9 years old with the expression of a person taking the matter extremely seriously. And Alina, age 2, sitting on Rosa's lap with an expression of absolute confidence in her own importance, and a flower in her hair that she will, according to family legend, have removed and eaten before the photographer finishes setting up for the second exposure. The photograph sits, in that future, on the shelf above the fireplace in the ranch house that Harlan and Rosa expanded in the summer of 1890, added a proper parlor on the south side, and 2 more bedrooms because they were optimistic about the future in the specific way that people are optimistic when they have already proven that they can build things from difficult ground. The shelf above the fireplace, where the turquoise ring had sat, on a night in June, in the year that followed a man walking out of a woman's kitchen with the wrong question echoing behind him, and enough humility, just barely, to understand that the echo was trying to tell him something. The ring is on Rosa's hand now, worn smooth in the way of rings that are never taken off. The turquoise has that particular depth of color that good stone develops over years of being looked at and carried and kept close. It fits. It had always fit. He had just needed to earn the right question. Some evenings, when the work was done and Miguel had gone to bed over his mathematics, and Alina had finally accepted that sleep was mandatory, Harlan and Rosa sat on their porch the way they always had, in the cooling New Mexico evening, watching the stars appear above the mesa. The coyote sang in the distance. The sorrel, older now, gentler, fully trusting, moved somewhere in the dark pasture. "What's your question for tonight?" she asked sometimes. It had become a thing between them. The questions never stopped because that was how they had learned to talk, and more than that, it was how they had learned to keep learning. The questions were different now than they had been at the beginning. They were the questions of people who had been inside each other's lives long enough to know the shape of things, who asked not out of ignorance but out of genuine, ongoing interest. What are you thinking about? What would you change about last year? What are you most afraid of right now, and how can I sit in the dark with you? What's your question for tonight? She asked. And he thought about it, this man who had walked out of her kitchen, once with a ring and an idea and nothing else, who had come back the next day with only a willingness to be wrong about himself. He thought about the mesa and the stars and the sound of children breathing in their beds and the smell of sage in the cooling air and the warm presence beside him of the woman who had said the wrong question and given him everything. "Same as always," he said. She looked at him with those dark, entirely known and still endlessly surprising eyes. "What's that?" she asked, though she already knew. "How are you?" he said. "No, really, how are you?" She leaned into him, the way she had been leaning into him for 7 years, the way she would lean into him for all the years ahead, and she told him the truth, the whole truth, the complicated and beautiful truth of who she was and what she carried and what she hoped and what frightened her. And he listened, really listened, the way he had learned to. The mesa stood red against the dark sky. The stars burned enormous overhead. Somewhere on the north ridge, in the ground she could always see from wherever she worked, her mother's bones rested in the earth that her mother had loved, because you could see all the way to the edges of things. Rosa Wells had dug second wells into dry ground. She had stood before crooked commissioners and arrogant buyers and men who looked past her to address the room. She had built something real from the hardest materials, stubbornness and grief and courage, and the 4 minutes it takes to decide to keep going. And she had been loved by a man who had been wrong about her, who had watched her for 4 years from the wrong distance and built an idea instead of a knowledge, and who had, when she told him so, gone home and thought about why instead of deciding she was the problem. That was not a small thing. That was, in fact, everything. The stars turned overhead in the enormous New Mexico sky, rich beyond imagining, ancient and indifferent and beautiful. The coyotes sang. The horses moved in the dark pasture with the quiet authority of creatures that had been trusted and knew it. And on the porch of the house they had built together, Harlan Reed and Rosa Wells sat in the evening and talked about real things, the way they always had, the way they always would. The door was open. It would never close again.